So welcome to today's video, The Soul of the Soil. So one of the things that I really had no idea about and had a little bit of a hard time wrapping my head around when I first started making lifestyle changes was really understanding the relationship that soil had with the nutrients and the power and the ability that food had to become medicine. So I wanted to take a little time today because I know it was confusing for me, and I actually remember a couple different occasions having family debates with my brother and with my mom about the value of organic foods versus not, and if it was just a sham, and just having a lot of confusion, especially when I didn't fully understand those things as to what the big deal was. So when we look at the soil's ecosystem, it is truly miraculous. I mean, you look at just the smallest area and you have these roots and these earthworms and these funguses and bacteria and protozoa, and I mean, it's absolutely uncanny the amount of life and the environment that takes place and the way that that impacts every growing and living thing just in the smallest area of the soil. And so when you really start to absorb this, I mean, it's really mind-blowing to comprehend what goes on and what takes place to really grow a nutrient-dense food. So one of the books that was life-changing for me, if you want to understand a little bit more deeply about these things, and for me, knowledge is power. And so when I could understand something more fully, it absolutely helps me to have the motivation and the conversion towards sustaining and doing a habit or a practice. And so when we had gotten sick, me particularly and my daughter, I was trying to make these lifestyle changes and it was hard. But as I started to learn these things, it became substantially easier just because I really understood why this was so important. So I wanted to share a couple quotes out of this book that I just think really bring home some of these points. So one cannot really understand the value of foods without first studying the soil, what it is, and how it contributes to life and health. And I think this is profound and a lot of times gets skipped over, that we talk about healthy nutrition, but really, it doesn't matter how many vegetables you're eating. If they're not coming from a nutrient-dense soil, it's not going to really do you a whole lot of good. 1 teaspoon of non-chemically treated soil hosts more living creatures than there are people in the world. I can't even quite wrap my head around what that means. But to think that that habitat is so alive and has such a huge impact on what grows out of it, that 1 teaspoon of non-chemically treated soil hosts more living creatures than there are people in the world. I mean, that's incredible. It takes between 100 and 1,000 years for natural forces to form 1 inch of topsoil. And this becomes really important because the topsoil, that incredibly rich, dense topsoil that takes years to form, is a lot of what gives our food its nutrients and its life. And recognizing that most farmlands in the United States today are working with a mere 6 to 9 inches of topsoil, when ideally it should be closer to 12 to 18 inches for nutrient-dense food to thrive. And when America was first settled, it was closer to 18 to 25 inches of topsoil that they were living with. But what's happened is that over time, in order to produce more food, to make more money, to commercialize things more effectively, they don't do proper farming practices to sustain this topsoil. Instead, they're breaking it down more and more and more every year, which leads to less and less and less nutrient-dense food. So, what do we do with that? So first of all, look at this whole organic component. Now, one of the things to recognize and why sometimes there's a little bit of hesitation or skepticism around organic food is that it's like, well, where did this whole organic thing come from? Well, it's really having the realization that up until, the last couple decades, well, more like, a few, been quite a few decades at this at this point. But when we were looking at when they were starting to make the transitions and adulterating our food, before that, when we had our grandparents' food or things as such, all food was organically grown. There wasn't an issue with this. Organic farmers were just regular farmers, and their farming practices would rely on crop rotation and cover crops and dense planting rather than using toxic and persistent pesticides, herbicides, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers to enrich the soil in which they were growing their crops. So they were practicing these practices just as normal farming practices. And then when these practices started to break down, it now needed a name for those normal practices, which became organically grown food. And I'm not sure how it got, its own name. I think the processed food maybe should have gotten its name. And organic food just should have been named food. But that is where that breakdown started to happen. So when we look at the impact of pesticides, I'm not sure you even need much explanation, but when you have to wear a hazmat suit to spray pesticides, they're probably not very good for you. And so what happens when we use pesticides on our food is it contaminates the soil. So that beautiful, incredible ecosystem that we were just looking at begins to break down. And when that system starts to break down, then it creates mineral imbalances. And when those imbalances happen, it starts to disrupt the soil ecosystem. And then the impact of that is that you no longer have nutrient-dense food that is growing in a healthy way. And so one of the huge eye-openers for me on this was with glyphosate, which is a huge, huge pesticide that's used, and it's aka Roundup. And I was watching this, it's like a 9 or 10 part documentary series called GMOs Revealed. If you don't want to know the truth about things, I don't recommend watching it. It's like opening a massive can of worms. But one of the things that was just, it really was probably life-changing for me, was an episode that talked about that there wasn't a single place in the world that they could find that didn't have traces of Roundup in the air or the water, which is just devastating. But they also talked about how glyphosate is a metal chelator. And what that means is that it actually helps to transport metals up into the brain. And so one of the big, big dangers of eating pesticide type foods is that you're now transporting any heavy metals that have been in the system up into the brain, which has pretty profoundly disruptive impacts on your brain and on your body. So definitely not a great thing to be in contact with on a regular basis. So then we've got that component happening, and what started to happen is that you use these pesticides, you completely disrupt your ecosystem, and your plants start not doing quite so well. And thus came about genetically modified foods. Now, I found this quite interesting when we were looking at why we use GMOs. GMOs were and continue to be developed to help farmers with their crops and to produce safer, more consistent medicines and vaccines. Now, a lot of times this is the type of stuff we get told, but I don't think we always look at, well, what's kind of the basis of that? So here it says some GMO plants are resistant to certain herbicides, making weed control easier and more efficient, which sounds great. But the problem with this is back to our pesticides, is anytime we use pesticides like that, you completely disrupt the ecosystem. And so then what happens is your plants are not going to thrive. And so plants have a natural mechanism in them that they die if they're not in a prime condition. And so if a plant is not growing a nutrient-dense food, it will die on its own. It will actually attract insects. It will actually create this type of reaction that encourages it to die because it's no longer producing the type of food that it should be producing. So now what you've got is this food that was naturally created to die when it's not in those type of healthy conditions is now being genetically modified and forced to stay alive and to grow and to thrive even when it should have been dying because its ecosystem is gone. It's no longer nutrient dense, and it's being sprayed with all of these pesticides that would typically be very terrible for it, but now it's been genetically altered so that it grows anyways, which becomes very confusing for the consumer because you get these foods at the grocery store that look beautiful and amazing, but they have no nutrient value, and they also are riddled with pesticides and have a really poor impact on your body. The next bullet is others create an internal defense in the plant that repels only particular insects that would destroy the crop. So then you've got some of these plants that are actually altered to genetically repel different insects. Well, this has become quite controversial as well because when you're messing with the genes of a plant in that way and it's expressing in a unnatural way, there's a lot of controversy as to how that's encouraging your own genes to express once you eat that type of a food. And so when we look at these things, it's really looking not just at the beginning questions or the beginning processes, but how is that impacting your body? And there's a lot of evidence now showing how detrimental this is to our health. And there's various countries that have actually banned GMOs, and even more countries that require them to be labeled as GMO, where neither of those are the case in America. So really all you have to rely on is the labeling that something is non-GMO. And the last point that I thought was interesting was that it says GMOs are being tested for enhanced nutrition, which I think is so ironic because the whole point of our soil's ecosystem is to enhance the nutrition of a plant. But GMOs were created in order to completely destroy that ecosystem but force the plant to grow anyways. So sometimes the messages that we get told or get shown are not quite the truth or the reality of actually what's happening underneath that. And so going back to the soul of the soil, going back to what those things truly mean, going back to even 2,000 plus years ago when Hippocrates even said, "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." So it's my hope that this will help you understand a little bit more clearly why it is helpful to buy organic foods, or AKA just regularly farmed foods, and why it might be important to be a little more conscientious or cautious of foods that have pesticides or that are genetically modified. And this takes time. This is a process. But I had referred to in another video, and I will link to that below as well, that start looking at things like the environmental working group. There's the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen. Things like that are resources that can help you understand what things are more pesticide riddled, what foods are maybe don't have as many pesticides, and help you to begin on this journey. But my hope, again, is always to bring that knowledge, bring that empowerment so that you can begin to understand and make choices for yourself as to why this can be so beneficial to dig a little deeper into the quality of our food. Thanks for joining. Look forward to talking with you next time.